Minot's Mark Jantzer was honored today by the Air Force for his service to the community. The Secretary of the Air Force presented Jantzer with the Distinguished Public Service Award. It goes to a non-government employee civilian. Jantzer has served as a connector between the community, the base, and the Air Force for the last 12 years to advocate for resources airmen need.
We can educate people about what happens when funds are cut short and missions are affected.
Now, Commander Hoadley with the 5th Bomb Wing actually presented Jantzer with the award on behalf of the Air Force. He says one example is assisting at the state level for Air Force spouses to transfer their licenses if they come to North Dakota. Jantzer has served with the Air Force Chief of Staff Civic Leader since 2010 and as a Minot Alderman since 2008. Congratulations to him.